Good morning. My buddy Tom Ball, my old college buddy, called me a couple of years ago, last year. We started talking about finance and some other things, and we've had some discussions on and off about time. And so I respect the guy and appreciate him. And he sent me this on my Facebook, which I hadn't seen yet. And I wanted to take the time to thank him for sending that, as well as, just kind of talk about what this means and why these graphs are the way they are, and the difference between what real information looks like, scientifically measured, econometric information measured, and et cetera. So for those of you who don't know, I am Sergio Garcia. I am a PhD in finance. I've spent the majority of my time working on econometrics and econometric modeling. I do some personal finance stuff on the side, and I own a small consulting firm in South Texas that does econometric modeling. I am not a health-specific econometrician. I'm mostly focused on investments and economic information, but this is classic time series data, and so this is not very different from what we do on a regular basis. So, what the health data, what this particular researcher, whose name I don't see, is suggesting is that this particular model projects the total number of beds that we're going to need at peak, when the peak of this particular situation is going to peak, the total number of ICU beds that are needed, and the total number of ventilators that are needed at peak. And so how many do we have to make in the United States? Is this the United States? Yes, this is the entire United States. And ostensibly we can go down to Texas, because I know most of y'all are from Texas. And so here's our Texas numbers, right? Interestingly, the curves are, well, I'll talk about that in a second. So in the United States, you can drill down on this website and then do whichever one you want. But in the United States, we are going to peak in the total number of needs on April 11th, which is about 3 weeks from now, 2 weeks from now. And then we're going to peak in the total number of hospitalizations probably a couple of 2-3 days later. So basically we're aiming for April 15th, according to this model. And I'll tell you why I like it and why I believe it. And in many ways, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, how do we get back to normal? How do we signal to each other that we're getting back to normal? When is it okay to go back to work? And those are particularly difficult questions. And it's not going to be simply your local or federal government telling you, okay, everything's fine. We're still going to have a sense of dread. Even if you've already had it and don't know it, or if you had it and you do know it, or you don't have it, and et cetera, et cetera. And so if you wanted to turn around and say, hey, we're going to be okay or not okay, this is a good website to show you that, hey, we're going to be okay, not okay. So, I mean, if you just look at this thing and you say, hey, look, we're going to have a total number of ventilators needed on the 1st of June of, a little over 1,000, and we think that the medical folks can handle that, well then, you stay home, or very, very limited movement until the end of May, until June. And that means now we can make some decisions about what we think we should do, such as keeping your kids home from school. And looking at this kind of mathematical model, you're like, yeah, there's no reason for the kids to go back to school. We don't need a second peak to pop out here in May because the kids are not social distancing. So for all practical purposes, my opinion on the matter has changed, and I am in favor now of canceling all schools until the end of May. And that's not because I want my kids here, or I don't want my kids here, or I have an opinion, or because I'm a Democrat or a Republican or whatever. It's because mathematically this model turns around and says, hey, look, we are way off peak at the end of May. We get to the 1st of May, and we're still halfway from the peak. There's still need. There's no sense in popping it back out. They're going to do 3 more weeks anyway. No big deal. We do graduation ceremonies in August instead of May, and we just keep right on going. And so let me talk about this curve and what it means. Let's focus on this one because the graph is nice and fat here. This is all beds needed. 231,000 people-ish should be hospitalized across the country at that point in mid-April. And what the gray area, or not, it's not a gray area, what the shaded area in the same color means is that we don't know what the actual number looks like. And so we run, in this case, a 95% scenario, and that means that 95, and I'm not going to describe it in great detail, but it means that the normal curve is spread out. We could be shifted high or we could be shifted low. So when we talk about worst case scenarios and best case scenarios, this guy up top here, in our case, is worst case scenarios. Often in different models, this would, the peak is positive. In this case, the peak is, it's not good. And so we could be up as high as 450,000, right? So when you hear the number that the highest number of people that are going to be hospitalized is 450,000, this is what this is what you hear on the nightly news, right? This number up here. And the best case scenario is that we'll be down here at the bottom, which is closer to 125,000, right? So it's possible that your buddies who are saying, hey, it's not a big deal, don't worry about it, might be correct, because that's the best case scenario. And so we just don't know what that looks like, and the closer we get to that day, the more accurate we're able to project it. You can see here at the beginning of the curve, March 23rd, and a couple of days later, that the gray area is very small. Well, it's easy to project what that best case scenario, worst case scenario is when you're closer to your actual projected time, and the further you are away, the harder it is to project. You'll see that this curve stays relatively fat until we get to June, and because these numbers get smaller and smaller and smaller, that grouping, that high case scenario, that low case scenario gets smaller and smaller and smaller as we move forward. And so by the time we get to June or July, the gray area, the high and the low, our ability to predict the high and the low, because we're dealing with smaller numbers anyway, are going to be easier to project. We're having a lot of difficulty projecting what this number looks like, because the number is big, because it is 3 weeks away, because we don't have a lot of data, and the spread is bigger than expected, right? And so what's really interesting, if you look at this thing, and this is not unexpected, but what's really interesting is that the ICU beds projection is much, much bigger than you would expect compared to the blue projection. And I don't know why that is specifically. We have to get into the deals of the math. Number of deaths per day. This is problematic. This is what people want to report on the news. It's what makes us really, really scared. Right now we are on March 28th. Well, it is the 28th, but let's go back to March 27th, because we can measure, this includes yesterday's numbers, or actually, this is as of March 24th. So that was 154 on that day, 200 today. We've got maybe 400. Yesterday we were in the 200s that passed away. That was reported, which ostensibly, now that I'm thinking about it, would be the 26th, right? So that's 273 is projected. So maybe we're under that number a little bit. It would be very interesting after this video tomorrow on Sunday to come back and watch this and see whether or not this projection of 437 was appropriately reported on Sunday, tomorrow, as opposed to today, Saturday, and see how close to that curve we are. And then you can make your own guesses. You can come back to this website and say, hey, well, they reported 380 instead of 430. Then we would, as statisticians, create a new curve. Let me see if I can do that here. We would then, as statisticians, that's my kid's homework, we would create a new curve that looks kind of like this, right? Because then we manipulate the curve and it changes what we're doing, because we see that those deaths are smaller than we anticipated that they would be, which is not to say that there's not fluctuations. You can see that there's fluctuations here and here, and then we just, we keep moving, and then we keep moving. And so hopefully that's why the first couple of weeks are so crucial, because if we can shift this curve to a lower deal here, then it's, then we can do a better job of projecting a smaller number, and that's okay. So don't be surprised if we get to 3 weeks from now, which means it's going to get progressively worse, right? People are like, it's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. Well, yes, it will. We should peak out at about 230,000 deaths per day. And so if that's the number that you're watching, you get to 2,000, we're starting to hit the top part of that curve. You get to 3,000, and then our projections are off. that's when, there's nothing to do at that point because we will have already laid infrastructure or not. But when we hit 230, and it looks like it flattens out real nicely there, and I don't mean nice like people are dying is nice, but like mathematically 230, 2300, I should say 2300, 2300, 2300, 2300, 2300, 2300. When we get back under 2000 at the end of April, now you know that the top of that crest has come. So if we peak at 2300 and we get back down to 2000, then we, hopefully at that point we're on the downswing. No sense in the kids going back to school in May. We're going to get back to June, and this is about the time that, we just heard this morning that the Tour de France, we're big cycling fans, Tour de France will make their decision about here, and then hopefully, if it doesn't look weird, the Tour de France should start in mid-July. And so that's where, whatever decision it is you're trying to make about going back to work or going back to school or going back to whatever normal means for you, that's kind of how we make it. I talked about this on Facebook once already. This is a cumulative projection curve. It will never go back down. It means we are adding up all the deaths on a regular basis. If you should watch the if you're watching the news and you're watching these numbers and see how they look like and how people manipulate these numbers, notice how the news is going to talk about total deaths per day, right? The red number, the red number, the red number, the red number. And then here they're going to give a good news that the total deaths per day has decreased. And by the time you get to April 20th, watch how the news is going to switch to cumulative deaths. Right? They'll go from reporting 2,000 people died today to a total of 36,000 people have died over the time period. Because at this point, this number is not going to sell newspapers, and this number will just continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's the difference between this is a semi-normal and a skewed normal distribution curve might look like. Sidebar, this is not a normal distribution curve. The total number of deaths pulled off of here looks like a normal distribution curve. We're treating it as if it were a normal distribution curve, and clearly it has some skewness to it, meaning that it's going to get higher faster and lower longer, right? We're going to be quicker to the top and slower to the bottom. So that changes the way that this S curve is skewed out. You can see it kind of looks like an S curve. This is a cumulative normal distribution, or a Gaussian distribution it's also called, bell curve, whatever. And that's what's interesting here. So if we get to the middle of May and we're at a total death number of 30, the inverse of that is true, right? We're going to say people who are very negative about the situation is going to say 2,000 people are dying per day, and glass half full people are going to be like only 30,000 total, and then there's going to be a switch on the down curve. People who are positive and want to see this thing go away will be talking about how this number drops by 50, 100 people per day, and people who are negative in personalities or reporting are going to switch to this total number, 50, 53,000, and so on, right? Our expectation is that we're going to lose 80,000, 81,000 people before the end of the summer. Hopefully the weather temps have some sort of, give us some assistance. And you can tell when I was talking about the shaded area that the shaded area here never gets smaller. Right? These numbers don't go back down. They're harder to project. If we were to do this expression or this estimation in June, we'd have a smaller number that would still look like expanding from here, but it would stay smaller. So this is never going to get smaller. This is never going to get smaller. This is never going to get lower. You'll see that the top part of this shaded area is much larger than the bottom part of the shaded area. 1, 2, 3, 4 bars as opposed to 2 bars. Why is that? That is because we know what the lower number looks like. As this increments, this lower number is going to stay lower. Because it's cumulative, we can only add more to the total number on top. The bottom number, once it levels off, will, because people will have died, it is a Boolean event. It is a binomial event. You either pass or you don't pass, and then that number on the bottom stays a lot flatter. And so now come all the different questions from both the positives and the negatives and the Democrats and the Republicans and yada, yada, yada. And so you can come here and download the data. The data looks like this. This is a panel data set. This is a panel data set because it has all the information by state and it has all the information by date. And then if you scroll down far enough, you have the next state and the next set of dates. And you can tell that there are 0, 0, 0, 0s, and then lots of numbers, and then the zeros start coming again, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, except for obviously the total number of the population. And so you can watch, you can go down to, let me see if I can do this without wasting a lot of time. Create that, and go up and create a filter, and let's go to Texas, where are you, Texas? I'm right here. And so there's Texas, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And if we look at the total numbers, we're going to get big, we're going to get fat. We have a bigger population, we're going to have larger numbers. And here is the distribution of what we look like. Texas, we're estimating that 4,000 people will die in the state of Texas. And, we just had one of our close friends, a man that I've served with in times of war, lost one of his best friends in the state of Texas. And so I recognize that, this thing hurts and that it's real. And so to turn around and say only 4,000 people are going to die in the state of Texas as an estimation is a relatively small number. But obviously we recognize that it hurts. And so, from an economic standpoint, that's not a big number, and we should be getting back to normal, and businesses should be getting back to normal by the time we hit June, July, and things are going to be okay. But yeah, we recognize that this is 4,000 people in the state of Texas that, it's going to cause pain and clearly divisiveness, and hopefully that this kind of information helps alleviate some of that. So you can get your data here, and you can also get the methodology up here, and that'll eventually lead you to this website, which, if you find the right stuff, will lead you to his paper. Now, I recognize that people don't want to read this stuff, but you should know that this isn't just some guy at CNN who's throwing something on the screen. Well, this is kind of what we think it looks like. Well, no, that's not what's happening. And let me explain what a research paper looks like for those of y'all that don't see this all the time. This is kind of what we do, what we nerds do when we have fun. These numbers up here at the terms of the finding and the summaries and the key points, we've kind of already talked about that. You know why it's important. The objective is to determine the extent and timings of deaths. From this, we can make decisions on whether or not we keep schools open and closed, and so far, and as as I just expressed, looking at the graph, I have changed my opinion about schools opening and closing, right? And so if this is mid-May, we're coming off the curve, there's no reason not to have at this point, there's no reason here in May to decide that the kids go back to school. And so if you're a parent and you're trying to make decisions about the manner in which you're going to homeschool, my expectation to you is your kids are probably not going back to school. That's where this comes from, and that's why these papers are so important. And you want to put it up front for people. What's in it for me? This is what's in it for you. You need to decide how you're going to run your household based on this, because the federal government's going to get recommendations from guys like me who are going to say, there's no reason to go back to school. This is why. You want to have a second curve. No governor wants to have a second pop in the curve. Your kids aren't going back to school, and so on. And that's how we make these calls. Funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So if there's any bias, and the state of Washington, if you see any bias, that's where the bias would be. In this case, thanks to Bill and Melinda Gates, yada, yada, yada. And so I, as a methodology guy, I jump down to the numbers and I skip all the other reading. And this tells me how we are measuring stuff. And so this number right here, which you don't have to memorize, basically says the cumulative curve. The cumulative death rate for each location is assumed to follow Gaussian error function, which means that the error functions, not the actual curve itself, but the errors to that function are normally distributed. That's a really good sign. It means that there is a stochastic, that doesn't mean anything to you. It means that we can do a pretty good job of actually projecting it, right? And so, well, how do they do this? Well, this is closely the value of the covariant multipliers, yada, 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 follow the fit obtained from the data from Wuhan. This is critically important. This line says, we looked at what the curve that happened in China and when it peaked and how it peaked, and we used that curve and our first week numbers to project what was going to happen over the next month, month and a half, 2 months, whatever. The critical the critical criticism of this particular deal is that the Chinese numbers are completely wrong, that they're small and they're woefully underreported. While that may be true, and I believe that it is, there's no way that the Chinese numbers are smaller than our numbers in terms of pure population and just lifestyle choices. It's just not possible. And so that's I shouldn't say not possible. I should say highly unlikely. They have probably gone unreported. They have probably been stamped down by a communist government. Whatever your belief is, on the data itself, you're probably right, but that's not what matters. What matters is that the actual curvature of that curve peaked and ebbed and and was tamped down. And so we don't really, as econometricians, we don't really care what the numbers look like. We care what the curve looks like. And so what this one line is saying here is we are looking for the fit of the curve and then using our numbers to project the fit of the same curve. So forget about the China arguments and their actual numbers. That's not what's important. What's important is that the curvature comes up, it peaks, and it comes back down. Why Wuhan? Because they were the first ones. That's why. And so we can look at the Korea numbers and we can look at the Hong Kong numbers, and their curves are a lot more flat. They are flatter curves, and that makes perfect sense because they have different implementations of strategies. The Germany curve looks much flatter, different implementations of strategies. It's going to be very interesting for sociologists to look at cultural differences and how the curves look, but that's a different conversation. And so don't get caught up on the idea that the China numbers are wrong, therefore these numbers are wrong. Get caught up on the idea that the fit of the model, that the curvature itself makes a difference, and that's why this thing matters. Then you look at the total number of days that have different measures of growth rates, right? And that's kind of what this is alluding to here. The exponential growth of the cumulative stress was created by using the information on the blah, 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 that exceeded some measurable level. So now we're looking at this one measurable level, and then we modify those growth rates based on whether or not these particular restrictions are implemented. Closing of bars and restaurants, stay-at-home recommendations, travel restrictions. I don't know why 4 measures is 0. Ostensibly, and I'd have to look at this in over more hours, ostensibly 0 doesn't mean 0. 0 means growth rate on top of the death growth rate, if that makes any sense. We accelerate the rate of growth. Just for the record, Wuhan is used as 1 because ostensibly at the beginning of the Wuhan there was no social distancing, and so we are modeling the Wuhan number with the number 1. And then if measures are implemented, the growth rate actually gets decreased, which ostensibly is why all 4 measures are counted as 0. It doesn't mean that the growth rate for those with 4 doesn't grow. It means that the growth rate stays the same. And so this is pretty good math. I don't know what else I highlighted. I think that's all I highlighted there. This is pretty good math. I like this curve. Oh, you shouldn't. I like this curve. Where did it go? It went here. This is good math. This is good curve. I would use this website when making decisions about your businesses, about your kids, about when we're going to get back to some state of normalcy. Off the top of my head, before discussing this with the other advisors in our office, we are probably going to stay home till May 1st, at least. And I'm not sending the kids back to school, probably for the rest of the year. We may start doing some social interaction in May, other than running to HEB or whatever. A couple of, a couple of shopping trips here and there are probably okay or something like that, but there's no reason for the kids to go back to school before now at the end of the semester, and we'll probably go back to the office 1st of May, something like that. Hopefully, by the time we get to June 12th, which is my birthday, things will be relatively normal again, and we get to July and we can do things like, the Tour de France and the Summer Olympics, which I think has already been canceled, and so on. So I hope that makes a difference. Not trying to make people feel better about bad things. We're trying to make people feel better about what the future looks like. And so if you've thought that my posts on Facebook or my comments in person have been cavalier or have been uninformed or I'm just a jerk, know that we don't make these things in a vacuum. There is a peak that's coming, and when that peak comes, it's going to go back down. We will be getting back to normal. And there's going to be some pain along the way. So it's going to be good. It's going to be fine. It's going to hurt. And, and people ask me about the economy. Well, this is why I think the economy is going to get back to normal, because we're going to get through this and we're going to get back to work, and I think we're going to be okay. It's just going to hurt and it's going to suck. And, feel free to email me at sgarcia at endurancefin.com. I'm not going to put my website up, but ping me on Facebook or whatever you need, and we can chat. Have a good day in your house, like us.